Hello there, welcome back to another video. This time we're going a bit different. We're going to TV for a little while. So we're looking at Doctor Who in the Peter Capaldi era of Doctor Who. Now, as I've stated before, I'm a Doctor Who fan. I've always was. I started with Tom Baker, then there was Peter Davison, then I even went through the Colin Baker and Vince McCoy era. I've watched it in its return. I'm a fan. I've seen all the old episodes as well now. You know, it has its good times and its bad times. I'm still a fan. I just like the concept of it and the silliness of it, and it's a nice show because it knows it's silly, and the better eras understand there's a wonderful silliness to the character that you can really play with, which I think really came through in the Stephen Moffat era because he understood the absurdity of the character, and so he cast Matt Smith and he cast Peter Capaldi, two actors who could be funny but also be serious. They could go between both really quickly in a scene. I'll do the Matt Smith era another time, but I'm focused on Peter Capaldi era because I've been watching them over the winter basically because it's dark and cold and, you know, this was fun to do. So, Capaldi came in just after the 50th anniversary. So that was like 2013. Matt Smith was leaving. Matt Smith shot the anniversary special, and then the next story was the Regeneration story, into Peter Capaldi. And Capaldi was the first old Doctor for a long time because there'd been a Doctor. The Doctor started out as William Hartnell, who's an older character, and then it went to Patrick Troughton, who was a bit younger. Then John Pertwee, who was kind of in the middle, and Tom Baker was in his 40s. So it was always an older guy, but it would varied from 50s, 60s to 40s really. Then Peter Davison came in, he was much younger, so that gave it a different feel to it. Then they went back and forth after that. But when it came back with Christopher Eccleston, he was a guy in his 40s, so he was in the tradition of the original Doctors. But then they brought David Tennant in, he was in his 30s, I think, when he did it, or maybe late 20s, I don't know. So that was a younger Doctor. Then Matt Smith came in, he was in his 20s, definitely was in his 20s. He was the youngest Doctor when he started, but he was playing a Doctor who was an old man in a young man's body. So he was in a strange way, he was kind of almost the oldest Doctor, but he just looked young. But he was very fuddy-duddy and funny and strange, and he never quite understood the world. Very alien Doctor. So when they got to Capaldi, they actually finally went back to an older Doctor because they'd brought in John Hurt as a missing Doctor during the anniversary special, and he was taking Mickey out the younger Doctor, saying they're having a midlife crisis or something. So when Capaldi came in, he was a very different animal to what had come in the last 5 or 6 years. He was just very, very different from what we'd seen. But he was still an eccentric character actor, so that's what you need on Doctor Who. A character actor who can be weird but also be the lead man. He had all that there. But his famous part before this, I mean, Capaldi had started off playing sensitive young men. You know, he directed some short films that had got some Oscar contention. He played in Belfast Scythe movies, and he was always playing a sensitive young man. And then during his middle age, there was a sudden switch where he suddenly played Malcolm Tucker, who was a vicious political animal, who was one of the most vicious characters ever. And it was a real nice surprise to see Capaldi play this because it was completely different from what he'd normally done, and he was playing this utter bastard, really. And it was great because it was such a great character. So his next big part, I mean, he did a couple of things in between, but his next big part that made an impact was Doctor Who, playing Doctor Who. And as soon as he was cast, people were really happy because it was obviously, it just seemed like, yeah, obviously he should be Doctor Who. There was just something about him. Because it was a kind of mix of the two parts of his career, the most sensitive, in the air, weird character that played as a youngster, but it was also had the kind of acerbic feeling of the later era of his career, so you could put them both into one character. So what that did really was give him a fusion of what he'd been doing, but it also gave the character a different feel because he was completely different from Matt Smith's Doctor. He was completely different from all the Doctors in the modern era, apart from Eccleston, who had that same kind of older person feel to him, and he could be a bit rougher with the humans because he called them stupid apes. In this one, Capaldi was suspicious of emotion, suspicious of hugs, and he'd find it hard to deal with humans because he just wasn't good at it. So he gave it a kind of interesting feel to it. It was just this older guy who really didn't deal. He meant well, but he couldn't deal with the people and their little lives. It was just he was too busy trying to save them. He just like stay out my way until I call for you, basically. So that was kind of the Capaldi Doctor, this kind of guy who was gruff and hard to deal with. And he had different companions, but it was his Doctor was over 3 years. Now it's kind of 3 years per Doctor, really, kind of like. I think it suits the actors, because it's a show that's notoriously hard on the actors. I think it suits the actors because they get a good run at it, but there's an end point. And it means they don't get stuck playing that character all the time, because some of the other Doctors just stayed longer than 3 years. Because Hartnell and Trout both stayed 3 years, then they moved on back to... And Hartnell was a bit old at that point, but Trout went back to his normal career after that. John Pertwee stayed on for 5 years. He found it difficult after he left for a while to get a job because he was typecast. Tom Baker for 7 years, he found it really impossible for a while. But Peter Davidson and the other Doctors after him, they didn't stay that long and they went back to their careers. So nowadays it's usually 3 years. I mean, Eccleston was 1 year, but everyone else seems to be 3 years. And it kind of fits quite nicely, I think. It also means you don't get too bored with the Doctor. It's almost like they leave before you get a chance to be bored with them, so you can at least miss them after they're gone. I wish I'd done another year, but it actually works out quite well for everybody. And so Capaldi had his 3 years, but he was a Doctor who actually had 3 years where the character grew a lot and changed a lot. I mean, the characters of the Doctor through the other incarnations, like the Excellent Doctor changed a lot of that 1 year. And the next two, like Dave Tennant, Matt Smith, they changed a bit, but it was almost like a play on what they'd already brought up instinctively, and they were mining that a little bit more. But it didn't really change as much as the Capaldi character changed a lot. I mean, there was always this thing with him was he'd been the stuff he'd been through before affected him, so he was never quite sure he was a good man or not. And that was something that continued throughout, even when he became more relaxed and apart, there was kind of haunted feel to him that wasn't there for a long time, which made the part really interesting. The idea of he was a Time Lord, and he was a Lord of Time, and he had a kind of element to him that was alien and was a bit distant from everything, and because he was trying to fix things. And it gave it a different feel, and it gave it an interesting take on it. And he had companions who played off him well. I mean, Jenna Coleman as Clara started off with Matt Smith. It was very good with Matt Smith, but she was really, really good with Peter Capaldi because they were a really interesting team. It just two actors just clicked. Like, she was funny with Matt Smith, but Matt Smith's companion was really Karen Gillan as Amy Pond. And it's almost like Jen Coleman was his companion because they hit off each other because she was the one who dealt with people, and she was as much of a drown junkie as he was, and she was so that she could tell him off when he was being misbehaving because he was saying things he shouldn't say because he didn't care how he came across, and she was the human person who dealt with him. So it really worked. And then when she left after 2 years, he had another companion, Pearl Mackie, as Bill Potts, who was a very different companion. She was, because Clara was a kind of teacher, and she was just a student, this black lesbian student who, it sounds like a kind of a cliche, almost like they're trying to represent everybody in this character, but it worked because they cast it well and they wrote it well, and it was like just a character who happened to have these characteristics. And she could tell him off in her own way, and she was much more of a person who was getting taught by him, but she pushed back against him when he was being an idiot. There was also Nardo, played by Matt Lucas, who was who the Doctor treated almost like an idiot, like a pet. That was kind of fun too. I'm not usually a fan of Matt Lucas, but I think he worked pretty well in this one. But I mean, the Capaldi Doctor really was an interesting, curmudgeonly feel to him that was really unique and different from what had been done recently. There was also that haunted feel. And it's kind of funny because when you watch, I watched them all the way through from his first episode to his last, and there really is a progression in the character. Like, he starts out very contained and paranoid of himself, then he gets more relaxed, and he goes from the more formal suits to much more of like casual get up. Sometimes he wears formal suits, sometimes he wears casual suits. He's got a guitar he plays in the TARDIS. He's a lot more relaxed, but he still has that kind of distance feel. He's like the character's trying to relax a bit more, but he's still got the kind of paranoia about who he is. And then the character slowly became more obsessive and darker, but it was also the lighter side Dave as well. I mean, there was a petty side. There was an episode where Doctor Who met Robin Hood, and they were both as petty as hell to each other, which is really funny. Just watch them just back to children. And as the seasons went on, it became much more haunted by the relationship with Clara, because they pushed each other to the extremes, to the point where she get killed, and he tries to bring her back, and it becomes this really thing with someone going way too far into their own obsession, until he has to forget she ever existed to actually be able to move on, which was a really dark, twisted thing. It was very Stephen Moffat. And then when we met the Pearl Mackie character, he deals with her as well, and he's trying to teach her, and she dies as well. It doesn't pay to be a companion with him. You will die. There's that kind of haunted feel throughout him. Was like, by the end of that, I mean, one of the big stories at the end is he wants to die rather than regenerate again, because everybody he knows just dies in his incarnation. I mean, they come back in a different way, but they all die, and it's like there's a kind of feeling with him. It's like much more doomed, you know. And he's also trying to bring the Master back to be a decent person rather than just be a maniac as well. And his Master is played by Michelle Gomez as Missy, so she's changed gender, and he's trying to show her that you don't have to be evil. And there's a lot of really interesting darker elements throughout his era, just because who's playing him, and he gives him a bit more scope to be dark and to be like, he can be nasty to the villains. He doesn't have to be nice to them. The way that some doctors in the past would be a bit more diplomatic to them. He would just call them idiots, and he'd call his companions idiots if they were being idiotic. It would, he wouldn't have any time for anybody if they were getting in his way. And that's what's wonderful, this version of the Doctor. But he also had some really good stories. I think his stories are underrated compared to the Matt Smith stuff, because Matt Smith stuff is faster and more fun, because Matt Smith played him sillier. The Capaldi era were darker stories. They were actually more traditional. They seem to go back more towards the older series in a way that the newer series never did before, but these were more traditionally going back to the older stories. You had some two-parters that were set at underground bases and things, like an underwater base. There was a sense of more Gallifrey, more of his home in it, and this one, more obsession with that. There was just a sense of a bit weightier and more old-fashioned, and there was kind of nostalgia in his era for the old show, I thought. That there wasn't as much of in the earlier shows, because they were trying to build a new show out of what had been. And this was, I think his era was much more like, we can actually look back in the past now and actually be nostalgic for it in a way that's not forced. It's just like the character's a bit more nostalgic for his past and thinking about it a bit more. And that kind of really worked. Because before we went nostalgia to the past, it was very quick, very basic. You met up with Sarah Jane Smith from the old show, but they were there every so often. this is a more mellow feel, that it just went back to the kind of older type of stories. You'd Ice Warriors, some older villains, but giving them their due, basically. I mean, he went up against Daleks and all the old foes. I mean, up against Davros in a really terrific story, which looked at the beginning and development of their rivalry. There was stories that were more less science and more fantastical, and there was stuff about what is there sounds you don't, is there something that you can't see logically that's still there, that's still a threat, and it's weird psychological stories like that had a kind of Tom Baker feel to it, and there was just a lot of, when back there was actually kind of quietness to the stories that were very different from what had come before, and it was just like more talking to people, more getting a point of view. There's more speeches to the villains to try and get them to actually listen and actually be logical and not be greedy. There's a more speechifying Doctor, but it was slower. It was just a different feel to it, which I actually really enjoyed, and on the rewatch a lot more. I think because Doctor Who's episodic, you actually expect less of a link between the stories, and there was more of a link here. So if you watch them in order, you feel there's more of a story than you would if you watched them season to season. And I think that really helps actually watch them all the way through, because you actually see this Doctor has a longer story that actually does make sense. And it works really well. I mean, the best story he had really was when he's stuck in this castle for, it's a 45-minute story, or maybe an hour, I think it was a bit longer than normal, where he's stuck in this castle, he's trying to get out and it's a trap, and he has to find a way out of it, and it's a very much a silent episode, which is him talking to himself. The only thing he's doing is talking to himself, and that's, and a lot of times it's just him watching things and figuring it out, and it's a really brutal episode, but it's acclaimed as one of the best ones of Doctor Who stories, because it really is excellent. There's a lot of stories like that. There's lots of stories of him dealing with the consequences of past actions and having to deal with things he's done in the past and how they've run out of control, and he has to try and find new ways around it. So dealing with Missy, trying to deal with these other creatures who can change shape to look like humans, and how they've been integrated in humanity because they can't survive otherwise, and how they rebel and how he has to try and talk them around. Things like that just come through. Try and deal with the past a lot of time, because he's dealing with Gallifrey and where it is and what it means to him, what his show means to him, and there is a kind of melancholy feel to him. And there's a really, his final like 2-part story in the main series before he did the final special was a really interesting story where they're in a ship that's going towards a black hole. So time's dilated, so if you're on one side of the ship, your time goes fast, on the other side of the ship, your time goes very slow. So, you know, the whole lifetime's on one side of the ship, and it's minutes on the other side, and you're up and down this ship trying to solve this problem with these Cybermen. Those stories really were his era, where it was a problem that took place over time. There was another one where he was dealing with a problem with lack of sleep. What happens if people don't sleep? There's monster comes out of lack of sleep. There's lots of weird, creepy old stories that do feel more like the Tom Baker era than what's coming this time. I really enjoyed. It was really a throwback feel. I think that's why his era, I think, is really interesting and intriguing. He makes a mistake also in the second season where he gives this girl who dies the chance of eternal life, where she keeps on, she can get killed. And it's, well, what's the cost of that? So he makes horrible mistakes throughout as well. He's a very fallible version of the character. And of course, at the end, he actually has to meet up with himself. He has to meet up with the older version of another version of himself, which is the first Doctor, the Will Hartnell one, played by David Bradley, and it's him coming to terms with himself as a Doctor and his first regeneration with his, what could be his last one, or not, or whatever, because the Doctor, neither Doctor wants to regenerate, and why don't they, and how they talk each other around, and there's another melancholy story where they find out the conspiracy they're trying to stop is actually not they're not villainous, so it's like, how do you deal with that? They're not villains. So it's a nice little twist as well. It's like the people they're trying to stop, they realise they shouldn't be trying to stop them because they're not bad people. It's like, and it's a very kind of, the thing they're trying to do is actually for the good of everybody. So that's a nice little twist, which you got more in the Capaldi era, this thing where what you expect from the villains isn't quite what it is. And a lot of the villains are kind of melancholy as well, that are tragic villains rather than out and out evil, which is a nice feel to them. It comes through the Moffat era a lot as they're less black and white, but especially the Capaldi era, they feel like even Davros, even though he's bad, there's still something really interesting in the way they use him in this era. So I hope you enjoyed this look through the Capaldi era. I'm sure most of the people who watch my videos are wondering why is he doing this, but I thought it was interesting for anyone who could be interested in this subject to talk about this era of Doctor Who. So I'll be back soon with some more videos, but this is probably the last one I'm doing this week. Bye for now.